The Huskies prep for Saturday's game against Arizona. 3 Sounders are named to the MLS Best XI for 2020, and the Seahawks take back control of the NFC West. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. We have episode 20. We get to talk about a Thursday night football game between the Seahawks and the Cardinals that finished up 28-21 to the Seahawks. Another nail-biting finish, Carlos Dunlap getting the game-sealing sack on a 4th and 10 play from the Seahawks' 20-something yard line. Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins had a chance to at least tie the game and try to send it into overtime. The Seahawks defense held strong and picked up the W, leaving the Seahawks at 7-3 after Thursday night's game. It's the first time that we've actually been able to talk about a Thursday night game for the Seahawks here on Around the Sound, which means it's kind of a mini bye week without Seahawk football this weekend. And the Seahawks get a long break until next week, Monday Night Football against the Eagles. We'll hop into everything to talk about the Sounders, the Huskies coming up, and the Seahawks game against the Cardinals. But before we get into any of that, I want to make sure that you all are following me on Twitter at @ThePeytonThomas, and of course the podcast Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. Don't miss a beat when it comes to that Instagram account at Around the Sound Seattle. We post a new episode of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Saturday. And of course, you can watch every episode of Around the Sound on YouTube at PTHOM space media. That's PTOM Media, or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. All right, Seahawks Thursday night football. Some news going into the game that's not particularly football related, but CenturyLink Field has officially been renamed to Lumen Field. It's not a change of branding per se. I think CenturyLink is just rebranding themselves now as Lumen. So apparently we're calling it the Lou now. That has been dubbed the new nickname. I've heard a few rumors of it on social media, and I mean, the Clink was good. I loved the Clink. I think it was a great nickname, but I'm really excited to see what the Lou can do for both the Seahawks and the Sounders 4 years to come. And so far, Seattle sports teams are 1-0 inside the Lou. So we get to see the branding, or we saw the branding on Thursday night watching the Seahawks-Cardinals game. It did look weird seeing that sign, especially in the south end that says "Welcome to CenturyLink Field," rebranded and re-spaced out to say "Welcome to Lumen Field" in Seattle. All right, Seahawks pick up a really crucial, important win. This was a real turning point in the Seahawks season because they decided whether they want to win this game and take control of the NFC West again, control their own destiny, and battle for that first seed in the NFC, or they could lose this game and kind of drift back into mediocrity and be fighting for one of those hotly contested wild card spots in a competitive NFC. Important win. The running game was back on track and made the offense work, and in my opinion was the most crucial part of this game. Carlos Hyde being back mostly. Bo Scarborough, who was an Alabama back and activated off the practice squad, also played. DJ Dallas had a little bit of contribution in that game as well, but a combination of no turnovers and Carlos Hyde cooking on the ground, even without Chris Carson. The fact that the Seahawks were able to establish the running game was absolutely huge. It made the Cardinals respect the running game. As soon as they respect the running game, Russell Wilson's going to be able to hit them every once in a while for touchdowns. Russell Wilson did not light up the stat sheet, but he had a really solid game. I think he finished 23 for 28, a chunk of yards and a couple touchdowns. Like I said, no turnovers for the Seahawks in this game. No turnovers for either team, but it was the Seahawks offense that was able to outscore the Cardinals offense, and that was the reason that they were able to win. Chris Carson was out for this game. Like I mentioned, the 3 running backs who got almost all the carries were Carlos Hyde, Bo Scarborough, and DJ Dallas, which is interesting because Pete Carroll had said to the media earlier this week, and especially last week, that Chris Carson was on track to come back and be worked back into practice before Carlos Hyde. He was healing up a little bit better than Carlos Hyde. So at the beginning of the week, most people expected that we would be seeing Chris Carson back as the workhorse running back and Carlos Hyde having to miss one more game before being healthy. It turned out that it was the complete opposite, with Carlos Hyde actually getting the start on Thursday night, with Chris Carson having to sit out one more game. I would expect both of those guys to be healthy for the Eagles game next week on next Monday. But Carlos Hyde did really well. He took that workhorse back role, had plenty of carries, plenty of yards, and really made this offense run. And I would expect Chris Carson to take that kind of workload and find success in the game, but I did not expect such a performance out of Carlos Hyde. He really, really impressed me. The Seahawks finished that game with 21 rushes and 28 passes, a breakdown that is what Seahawks fans were used to seeing earlier on in Russell Wilson's career when the Seahawks found success. It was relying on a workhorse back. It was a run-first offense with the ability to pop because Russell Wilson has that deep ball. When Pete Carroll and the Seahawks have success on offense, it's these kind of games where they go back to running the football, establishing the run, and then surprising teams with the pass. When Russell Wilson got into trouble, started throwing interceptions, threw 8 interceptions in 3 games, those 3 games being before this Thursday night game against the Arizona Cardinals. When he threw those 8 interceptions in 3 games is when the Seahawks could not at all establish the running game. Last year against Green Bay, when the Seahawks got knocked out in the NFC divisional round, you had to bring on Marshawn Lynch because you had so many injuries across the board at running back that you had to bring in an old veteran. You couldn't establish the running game because Marshawn Lynch last year was not the runner that he used to be. When the Seahawks didn't establish the running game, they got down in that game, could not fight their way back, knocked out of the playoffs. The running game, establishing the running game is so crucial to Russell Wilson's success and the Seahawks offense success as a whole. So shout out to Carlos Hyde and especially the offensive line for making that work. Damian Lewis, the normal right guard, the rookie out of LSU, has been playing exceptionally well this year, really punching above his weight. Had to play center this game due to both Ethan Posick, the starting center, and Kyle Fuller, the backup center. Remember that Kyle Fuller, the one who snapped the ball at Russell Wilson's feet, causing that fumble last week against the Rams. Both centers were out for this game, so Damian Lewis had to slide over to that center spot, and he played really well. There were no snap issues. The offensive line seemed cohesive. You had Shell and Jamarco Jones also on the offensive line playing really well that night, shifting around. A really complete performance from the Seahawks offense. And while Russell Wilson may not have been lighting up that game with MVP numbers like the Seahawks were used to getting out of him in the first few weeks of the season, it looked like a Seahawks offense that was very careful with the football, and they were moving down the field effectively, but you never felt like the Seahawks were in danger of forcing a turnover. There was one moment where Russell Wilson pitched the ball back to Carlos Hyde, and Carlos Hyde almost fumbled the ball. Well, he did fumble the ball and recovered his own fumble on the ground. Other than that, there was no real moments of mental mistakes on the offensive side, either between the offensive line, between the receivers, between the running backs, or Russell Wilson, of being careless with the football at all. We did see a couple drops from the receivers, and I'll get to that. It was mostly on DK, which was really interesting, but no significant mental errors that resulted in turnovers on that Seahawks offense. That's the reason that the Seahawks offense were able to keep their defense in the game this time around, which didn't happen last week against the Rams when the Rams were able to beat the Seahawks. So I mentioned DK Metcalf had a couple drops, and he did. I don't know if I want to call this significant drop issues. People are talking about that DK comeback game. He had 3 catches for 46 yards and a touchdown. That first touchdown was a great grab and a great route. Other than that, DK did have slightly a quiet game, or not all of his headlines coming out of this game were completely fantastic. What doesn't show on that scoreline of 3 catches and 46 yards is a pass interference penalty that DK forced Patrick Peterson into on a deep route. Russell Wilson throw it up for DK Metcalf. Patrick Peterson tugs on DK Metcalf's jersey just a little bit. It was a little bit of a weak pass interference call, but you could understand how if Patrick Peterson was grasping DK's jersey and trying to pull him back, you could understand how that's pass interference if DK Metcalf wasn't able to get to the ball and was slowed down because of that jersey pulling. Ended up in a massive pass interference penalty that put the Seahawks first and goal on like the 9 in I believe the 3rd or 4th quarter. I know it was in the second half. No particular receiver lit it up. Everybody kind of contributed on the Seahawks offense, and that speaks back to a normal Pete Carroll offense. This wasn't the Seahawks offense that we saw in the first 5 weeks of the season that got the Seahawks to that 5-0 start. That was a Seahawks offense that was based on Russell Wilson making great plays, putting up insane MVP numbers that, looking back, seemed a little bit unsustainable, and we've seen that they are unsustainable in the latter 5 weeks, in the latter 5 games that the Seahawks have played as up to this point. But this is much more of a Pete Carroll offense in this game, establishing the run first. You have 3 running backs that are all getting carries, all picking up yards. You're not relying on Russell Wilson to make big plays every single drive, but you know he is capable of throwing a great deep ball and torching the Arizona Cardinals secondary for at least 1 or 2 touchdowns over the course of that 60 minutes and the whole game. But DK's drop issue, there was one play where DK was coming over the middle. Russell Wilson threw an absolute fastball, a total pass that just had a million miles an hour of heat on it, and DK Metcalf straight up dropped it in the end zone. I remember watching the broadcast, and I saw the ball kind of come out of Russell's hands and then end up on the ground in the end zone, and I was thinking, did a defender tip that down? Did he swat it down? I was like, there wasn't really anybody in front of DK Metcalf. It looked like the ball got through, and when you saw the replay in slow motion, DK Metcalf should have had another touchdown in this game. Dropped that one. I know DK and Russ were going back and forth a little bit on social media, poking fun at each other. DK Metcalf wanted Russ to apologize for that fastball, but in my opinion, if you're an NFL wide receiver, especially DK Metcalf, I think you got to haul that one in. Speaking of everybody contributing on the offense, I thought the tight ends also contributed pretty effectively. Greg Olsen had a couple catches until he went down with a foot injury in that game. It looks like this injury could be 6 to 8 weeks, and Greg Olsen's old. Seahawks are going to put him on IR. He's going to be eligible to return whenever he gets healthy. Or initially, they were wondering if it was going to be a 4 to 5 week injury. Now they say that it'll be lucky if it'll be 6 weeks. It could be as long as 8 weeks. I can't help but pondering whether this may be the last that the NFL as a whole sees of Greg Olsen. In this past offseason, there was talks of Greg Olsen actually joining the Fox network crew and covering NFL games and retiring from the NFL. Seahawks offer him a contract. He comes back in, stops contemplating retirement, signs a 1-year deal with the Seahawks. This was kind of the farewell parade for Greg Olsen. I think everybody expects that after this year, he will actually retire and probably still join the Fox crew. But he's old, and coming off that big injury, you have guys that are very capable behind him in Will Dissly. You have Jacob Hollister, who both have had moments of brilliance for the Seahawks in the last few years. Between those two guys, I would expect if Greg Olsen does get healthy, it will be in the postseason. I would expect both Dissly and Hollister, or at least one of those guys, to really be in a groove and have earned that tight end 1 spot. I think this is the last that we'll see of Greg Olsen in the NFL. I have a real feeling that even if he is able to get healthy and back for the postseason, the Seahawks probably won't be using him much. It'll mostly be on Will Dissly and Jacob Hollister to take that tight end workload as a blocker, but also as a vertical threat going forward. So we talked about the Seahawks offense for quite a bit, and the offense was good, but they met expectations. That's the kind of Seahawks offense that we expect, an offense that won't turn the ball over too many times, an offense that will put a significant amount of points up on the board. But the defense was great this game, and it was comparatively great. Did we see a performance like the 2013 Seahawks put out a performance every week, keeping teams to an average 13 points a game? No, the Seahawks defense still gave up 21 points, and Arizona had a solid drive in the last minute of the fourth quarter before they were ultimately stopped, a good stop and a sack by Carlos Dunlap. But the defense greatly exceeded expectations for what kind of games that they were playing for the first 9 weeks of the season. Far above expectations. I thought the coaching was really great. I think Ken Norton Jr. certainly had a comeback game. I still believe that Ken Norton Jr. should keep his job. I know there's so much hubbub on social media about Ken Norton Jr. should be fired. It's a coaching problem. I've said it before on Around the Sound, and I'm going to keep defending Ken Norton Jr. I think he's a great guy. I am biased because I do love Ken Norton Jr., and I've known him since he was just the linebackers coach. Well, I don't know him, but I've been following him since he was the linebackers coach in Seattle since 2012, 2011. He's gone to several different positions since then, but it was a great coaching, great schemes, and I think that overall the Seahawks defense made a lot of smart plays. They didn't give up a ton of big plays. They kept DeAndre Hopkins in check for most of that game, but the most important part was that pass rush. And I know in the last episode, in Wednesday's episode of Around the Sound, I had mentioned how getting to Kyler Murray was going to be extremely, extremely important in this game. If you recall, the last matchup between the Seahawks and Cardinals, there was 42 or 43 dropbacks for Kyler Murray, no sacks, no hits, and just one QB pressure. Now, that one QB pressure did end up in an interception for, I believe it was Quandre Diggs in that game. In this game, the Seahawks decided, and Ken Norton Jr. decided that he was going to send the heat, get to Kyler Murray, and not only did they limit Kyler Murray to rushing for only 15 yards in that game, which is his season low on the ground, they also got 3 sacks, numerous pressures. Carlos Dunlap picked up 2 sacks, including that game-clinching sack on that 4th and 10 play, but a really impressive performance in the pass rushing game, which, remember, think back to the 5-0 Seahawks. In the first 5 weeks of the season, that was the part of the defense that Seahawks fans should and were really, really concerned about. it seems like the Seahawks defense certainly turned a corner and took a step up in terms of pass rush and run stopping ability as far as quarterback mobility goes. Kyler Murray's a really fast. He's a guy that can get out of a lot of great pressures. There's not very many quarterbacks that have a better break sack ability in the NFL than Kyler Murray. The only one that comes to the top of my head right now is probably Deshaun Watson with the Houston Texans. But the front seven for the Seahawks did a really great job of keeping Kyler Murray in check and also getting to him. They rattled him several times that game and picked up 3 sacks. Carlos Dunlap had a funny quote after this game, and I wanted to share it here. He said, quote, "They shut down Hop all game, so they gave us the opportunity to keep him, Murray, running around." And he's talking about the secondary there, of course. But then he goes on to say, quote, "I like my odds. I'll chase after a squirrel all day," end quote. It's interesting. It's kind of a funny quote only because Carlos Dunlap refers to Kyler Murray as a squirrel. And Kyler Murray's a great player, and he's a great quarterback. I don't think he's as great as Russell Wilson, of course, but I do think Kyler Murray is a great quarterback, and he played a solid game. I think the defense certainly stepped up to that level, but it was funny hearing Carlos Dunlap refer to Kyler Murray as just sort of a squirrel, because he does kind of play that way in the pocket and he's able to escape a lot of pressure, but it seems like referring to him as a squirrel seems just a slightly bit derogatory after this game and after the sack. I wonder if there's a little bit of a rivalry brewing between these two players. I don't suspect that these guys are going to match up for the next decade, of course, Carlos Dunlap being a veteran at this point, but Cardinals Seahawks is certainly a rivalry, both teams being in the NFC West, and this might add just a little bit of fuel to that fire in case these teams match up in January in the postseason, which is certainly possible. I could see both of these teams having the potential to make a run in the NFC playoffs. Damon Snacks Harrison played a good game and was on that front. It was good to see him out there. He looked spry. He looked similar to the Damon Snacks Harrison that we had seen on the Lions across the NFL and on the Giants the last few years. He wasn't quite at that all-pro level, but he's still settling into the Seahawks roster, and it was great to see him out there. He was also a part of the front seven that never let Kyler escape, and when Kyler escapes, that's what makes the Arizona Cardinals most dangerous on offense. We saw it in the Cardinals game last week against the Bills on that Hail Mary play that DeAndre Hopkins mossed 3 defenders to come down with the game-winning walk-off touchdown for the Cardinals. Kyler Murray somehow breaks a sack, escapes out of the pocket, and chucks the ball downfield. Now, the throw was incredible and right where it had to be, but if you watch Kyler on that play, just his ability to stay out of the pocket and be dangerous and keep the play alive, the Seahawks avoided a lot of those types of plays of letting Kyler out of the pocket and letting him use his dangerous speed and his dangerous legs to take advantage of that defense. KJ Wright and the rest of the defense, who got juked out by Kyler Murray several times in the last game between the Seahawks and Cardinals, Kyler was not able to juke out almost any defender. This time, defenders stayed home. They didn't over-pursue when they faced Kyler Murray. They went for it and just went for a conservative tackle when he tried to break a tackle or get around them. I also want to shout out LJ Collier, who played like a first-round pick, and I'm not sure if that translated onto the stat sheet. I'm not sure if he got any hurries or rushes or sacks of that nature, but LJ Collier, he certainly seemed to be in Kyler Murray's face a lot. He also made a few big run stops on Kenyon Drake and Chase Edmonds in the Cardinals' running game, so an impressive performance for LJ Collier. I felt like every time Kyler was under pressure, had to throw it away, had to get rid of the ball quickly. In the replays, you seem to see LJ Collier pushing into that pocket and making things a little less clean in there for Kyler Murray, making him try to work to pick up yardage for his Cardinals offense. The Seahawks secondary also did not give up a million big plays. I thought the cloud coverage was especially good against a dangerous Cardinals offense that includes Larry Fitzgerald, includes, of course, DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, Andy Isabella, who's also having a great year. There was one Chase Edmonds touchdown where I think Jamal Adams broke coverage, and it was busted coverage, certainly. There's a photo of Chase Edmonds standing in the end zone about to catch the football from Kyler Murray, and there is no Seahawk defender within 20 feet of him. A busted coverage on that play that resulted in a Cardinals touchdown. The Seahawks seemed to blitz 6 or 7 to Kyler Murray on that play, trying to get to him, but he was able to find Chase Edmonds in the back of the end zone, wide open, able to lob it to him. So other than that one play of busted coverage, I thought the Seahawks secondary was pretty solid all game and avoided giving up the big plays. The number one thing that I saw this game, and I'd complained about it on Around the Sound either earlier this week or last week when I was previewing the Rams game, is the lack of complementary defense that the Seahawks had been playing for the last few weeks. Now, You can hear this in the Carlos Dunlap quote that I said a few minutes ago, where he mentioned that the Seahawks secondary did a great job of shutting down Hopkins all game. Now, complementary defense, the defensive line, the linebackers, and the secondary, the three tiers of an NFL defense, all three of them helping each other. The defensive line getting to Kyler Murray, hitting him, pressuring him so he has to get the ball out quickly. The secondary covering for the first 3 seconds of a play to give the defensive line a chance to get to Kyler Murray. It's complementary defense. One side helps the other side, which helps the third tier, the linebackers, try to execute both of those jobs, both in the run-stopping game and the pass coverage game. And every once in a while when you're blitzing, in the pass rushing game. The linebackers, depending on the play art, depending on the type of scheme, have to do all three of those roles sometimes. We saw complementary defense. We saw each sector of the Seahawks defense, each tier of the Seahawks defense continuously throughout the game help each other out and not really let each other out to dry, not let them hang out to dry per se. The defensive line kept getting to Kyler, did not force the secondary to have to guard those impressive Cardinals receivers and those Cardinals weapons for 5 to 6 seconds every single down. We saw the secondary do a great job of covering DeAndre Hopkins, Larry Fitzgerald, Andy Isabella for the first few seconds of plays that allowed the defensive line to get in and kept Kyler Murray from getting rid of the ball quickly. It was great to see that complementary defense from the Seahawks, and I hope to see that for the rest of the year. That's the biggest piece, is the pass rush and the pass coverage. It has to work together. Both of those things have to be working in order to stop a passing offense on the other side. It's the key. It's the part of the defense the Seahawks had been missing the last few weeks. It was the reason that the Seahawks had lost 3 of their last 4 games, or at least a significant part of the reason. This game, we saw certainly a step up from every unit of the Seahawks defense. This is kind of a little fun nugget, a little fun fact that came out of the game that I heard somewhere within the media. Carlos Dunlap now has more sacks in the last 3 games, his 3 games as a Seahawk, than Jadeveon Clowney has had in the last 2 years of his career. All the controversy surrounding where Clowney was going to go, a little bit of disappointment throughout the Seahawks community when Clowney decided not to return to Seattle. He goes to Tennessee and then talks down Seattle's defense and their defensive scheme just a little bit after he gets to Tennessee, which left a lot of Seahawks fans with a sour taste in their mouths when they think of Jadeveon Clowney. It certainly is a telling stat when Carlos Dunlap, who has been playing well, certainly in these last few games ever since he joined the Seahawks defense, more sacks in his last 3 games than Jadeveon Clowney in 2 full years. And I do want to mention the Seahawks game was still close. It wasn't like we saw a extremely impressive blowout performance from both sides of the ball that dominated Arizona. Arizona certainly kept this game close and had a chance to win. They were marching down the field with a minute to go. They had 1st and 10 on the 20-something before 3 incompletions that resulted in 4th and 10 before Carlos Dunlap was able to make that game-sealing sack. Arizona certainly had the opportunity to tie that game without that safety that the Seahawks had at some point in the 3rd quarter on an offensive holding call in the end zone. Without that, it certainly would have been a fascinating finish to the game with the Cardinals having a chance to win it in regulation. I want to talk about the upcoming path for the Seahawks because they have the easiest remaining schedule to play. I know I talked about the Rams and the 49ers both having played already a lot of easy NFC East teams, and they both have played the New York Jets. I don't know if the Rams have played the New York Jets. I know the 49ers have already played the New York Jets, but the NFC West gets to play the NFC East this year and the AFC East this year. You get a couple tough opponents in the AFC East between the Bills and the Dolphins. Seahawks have already moved past both of those opponents, but you do get to play the Jets, and you get to play all of the teams in the NFC East, which that division is just terrible. It looks like the Eagles could win that division and reach the playoffs, host a playoff game with only 6 wins in the regular season. But the upcoming path for the Seahawks goes as follows. You have Monday night against the Eagles next week, who are sitting at 3-5-1. They have that tie against Cincinnati from earlier in the year. Following them, you have the 3-7 Giants, then the 0-9 Jets, and then the 2-7 Washington football team, name redacted. We can't say it anymore. You can't screw that stretch up. I think the Seahawks need to go perfect through that stretch. It's also a really great stretch for Russell Wilson to regain his placement in the MVP chatter, because those are certainly teams that are lacking significant parts of their defenses. There's a reason that all of those teams have such poor records. Russell Wilson should be able to light them up and have a really great opportunity to insert himself back into the MVP conversation that he had sort of fallen out of in the last few games due to all of those interceptions. All right, let's move on to UW now, hosting Arizona at 5 p.m. Pacific time on Saturday. We don't get the incredible late game 8 Pacific start, 11 Eastern time start that we got last week when the Huskies played Oregon State. We get a little bit of an earlier game. We get Pac-12 in the evening at that 5 p.m. kickoff. UW's favored by 11.5 points in this game. I think that's a little bit generous. We'll have to see how the game plays out. In this game, what to watch for, the Huskies certainly want to show off Dylan Morris's ability to throw the ball and move vertically in the offense. Now, that's not what to watch for this game. I'm talking about in a larger context that over the course of the season, Jimmy Lake wants Morris to have the opportunity to showcase that ability. But Arizona has one of the worst run defenses throughout the Pac-12. This is not going to be the game that Dylan Morris is going to show off his arm, and the Huskies are going to show off their vertical offense air raid ability. I would expect Jimmy Lake to, quote, run the dang ball. We saw Jimmy Lake show up to a press conference after the Oregon State game wearing a hat that literally said, run the dang ball, except it didn't say dang. The running back committee for the Huskies should absolutely torch that Arizona defense. If you keep working in all of those guys that played well last week against Oregon State, you're always going to have a refreshed back there that isn't tired, and you're going to be able to run down that Arizona defense. An Arizona defense that gave up 173 rushing yards on the ground last year, 5.4 yards per carry against USC. Now, USC is a pretty good team in the Pac-12, but still, you do not want your defense taking those sort of hits all night in the running game. Last year, when UW traveled down to Arizona to play, they ran on Arizona's defense for 207 yards on the ground. I would expect a similar story here. Jimmy Lake was on the coaching staff for that game. Jimmy Lake knows what that Arizona run defense looks like. I would expect the Huskies to come out and run the ball and ground and pound all game. If they don't have to use Dylan Morris's throwing ability, they don't want to put that liability and that much pressure on their young quarterback. They're not going to throw the ball downfield unless they absolutely have to. So like I just mentioned, the best part of the offense to watch for in this game for the Huskies is the run. The worst part of the defense to also watch for is the run. The Huskies' front seven and run-stopping ability struggled for several parts of the Oregon State game last week, and Arizona has a good running back in Gary Brightwell. He's a big back that's similar to the Oregon State back that the Huskies saw last week. Arizona also has a very mobile quarterback in Grant Gunnell. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He runs often for Arizona, looking at the statistics. But this game's going to be played in the trenches. It's going to be between the offensive lines of both teams, how much space they can give those mobile parts of the backfield for both the Huskies and Arizona. It will see how those teams react to one another, trying to pound the ball, get some rushing yards on the ground. But looking on sort of the bright side, I would expect the Huskies team to just continue to get better throughout the course of the year. You have a new coach, you have a new quarterback who's still a freshman, very, very young, lots of room to grow. A high ceiling for both the quarterback and the coach. You also have a very young front seven and a young defense. This Huskies team is young. You saw them struggle for several parts of that Oregon State game, a game that really was closer than it probably should have been or needed to be. The Huskies shot themselves in the foot several times last weekend. We'll see if some of those mistakes get minimized. We'll see less mistakes as the season goes on. I would expect Jimmy Lake's going to get to know his quarterback better, get to know his offense and defense a little bit better. We'll see when the Huskies start piecing together a little more convincing results against teams like the Oregon States, like the Arizonas throughout the Pac-12. This game should be fun and interesting to watch. I still got the Huskies in this one, but I do think that 11.5 spread is just a little bit generous. We'll have to see how it goes. Moving on to our final piece of news, our final tidbit, all three of Jordan Morris, Nicolas Lodeiro, and Raul Ruiz-Diaz all were named to the MLS Best 11 list, having 3 of 11 players in the Best 11. Very, very impressive from the Sounders this year, considering there's 26 teams in the MLS. To have 3 players all in that lineup, very impressive. Lodeiro finished the season with 7 goals, 10 assists, Morris 10 goals, 8 assists, and Ruiz-Diaz 12 goals, 4 assists. There doesn't seem to be enough goals to go around, and that's the reason that you're not going to see a Sounders player win the MVP award this year, is they all contribute really effectively, and they're all such bright spots for the Sounders going forward that you don't have one star player that emerges between the 3 of them. Both Nicolas Lodeiro and Jordan Morris made the 5-man shortlist for the MVP award, but I wouldn't expect either of them to win it, simply because there wasn't enough goals to go around for the Sounders this year. They all kind of shared the spotlight, and it's tough to win individual awards when the Sounders play such a team-based style between all of those guys. Of course, the Sounders play their game on Tuesday, November 24th against LAFC. They're hosting LAFC in the first round of the Western Conference playoffs. A fun note from that game, well, I don't know how fun it is, the LAFC will be without Diego Rossi and a few others who got COVID on the international break. So it looks like the Sounders, who chartered their international players back, will have a full roster. LAFC limping into this game a little bit without their top goal scorer from this year. We'll talk about and wrap up that Sounders game on Wednesday on next episode of Around the Sound next week, but I won't see you guys until then. So we got through everything that we needed to get through today. We talked about the Seahawks. We have the Huskies to look forward to on Saturday. And then, like I mentioned, we have the Sounders playing on Tuesday against LAFC. Next week, we'll also have a full slate of NFL games this Sunday to talk about. No Seahawks because they played Thursday night, of course, but we see other NFC West teams and across the NFL, potential for the standings to shake up with everybody else playing. I know the Saints also have a potential to drop a game. Drew Brees was just placed on the IR list. Plenty of news stories, plenty of headlines to talk about next week. The news cycle keeps on turning. We also have the MLS playoffs starting up this weekend, so plenty of action to talk about next week on Around the Sound episodes, of course, always on Wednesdays and Saturdays. We'll have plenty of stuff to break down and talk about. Until then, I'll see you later. Stay safe and thanks for listening.